This lesson is on the importance of a well-rounded technique routine in music practice. And I'll be demonstrating today on the classical guitar, but I think that all this information should be relevant to any instrument. Follow the lesson for free and pick up all the tips, but if you're interested and you like the lesson, subscribe and feel free to visit our support page. There's a link for that in the description. So let me just outline what we're going to do today. We're going to be talking about the benefits of a well-rounded technique routine. I'll go over an early intermediate technique routine and what that might look like on the classical guitar. And I'll also be talking about examples of complementary techniques and how techniques complement each other to help you overall. If you're interested in actual technique routines for different levels like absolute beginner, late beginner, early intermediate, late intermediate, all the different levels, feel free to check out my technique book. There's not only the routines in there, but also the exercises as well. So feel free to check that out, and there's a link for that in the description as well. So I get lots of people writing into the website all the time asking, how can I improve this technique? How can I improve that technique? And I often end up asking them if they have a well-rounded technique routine. And there's a number of reasons I ask them that. But I think the first main thing is that your technique routine prepares you for your repertoire. Your technique routine is equivalent to studying all pieces. Not just one piece or another piece that you might be doing at a certain time, but you're maintaining your the way that we play music for all the pieces that you might encounter. So if you've been practicing your scales and there's a scale in your repertoire, you're prepared for it. If you've been practicing your bars, your barré, and it appears in your pieces, you're ready for it. If you've been practicing your ascending and descending slurs, hammer-ons and pull-offs and guitar lingo, then you're prepared for it. So whatever comes at you from your repertoire, you've already been maintaining that. It's not something you're going to have to practice a whole bunch. It's something that you've already been working on. So technique routines prepare you for your repertoire. The other thing is that techniques complement each other. So by practicing a variety of techniques, it may help you accomplish that one other technique that you are hoping to accomplish. So a very common example of this on the classical guitar is people will write in saying, how can I improve my tremolo practice? And, often I'll say my technique book has a number of exercises for tremolo, so you can practice those. Those are tremolo specific. But the thing is, one thing I'll often ask the student is, well, how are your MA scales? How are your IM scales? How are your arpeggios? Because if a student can do all those things really well, then they can probably play tremolo really well, because part of tremolo is just having dexterity in the fingers and the ability to control your fingers and relax and make sure that you can play things evenly. And so that dexterity and control comes out of practicing a variety of different techniques, not just tremolo, or not just exercises aimed directly at tremolo, but instead your overall technique. Now, I'll be talking more about that in just a second, but the last thing I wanted to mention is that in your technique practice, there's obviously maintenance and improvement sections. Certain things need to be maintained, scales, arpeggios, slurs. I find if I don't practice my ascending and descending slurs on a regular basis, they get a little sloppy. So there's a maintenance aspect. It's kind of like an athletics issue. I have to train and keep my athletics high so that my hands work and I can focus on the musicality and the phrasing and dynamics and all that. So there's that maintenance, but there's also improvement. There's areas of your technique that you're probably trying to improve, and so you'll be practicing exercises in those areas. And of course, that's important. But when I talk about a well-rounded technique routine, I just mean about making sure you have all that maintenance stuff as well as the stuff you're trying to improve. But that maintenance material and having a variety of material is really important. One last benefit of practicing a well-balanced and varied technique routine is that from in regards to your positioning and your hand positions, that physical technique, If you only practice a small, limited number of techniques, your posture and your hand positions could begin to become geared towards only those techniques. So if you practice only rest stroke scales, maybe you start holding your hand like this, but later on, a year from now, you have a piece where you mix rest stroke and free stroke, and you realize that this doesn't work. You need to be holding your hand like this to accomplish both rest stroke and free stroke. And so practicing a variety of technique will also inform your hand positions and your posture and your guitar position. You know, if you don't practice a little bit of stretch exercises, you can sometimes use a bad guitar position and it doesn't really affect you until you need to do that stretch and you need a slightly more vertical position. So that variety of materials will inform your hand positions and your physical technique as well. So let's go over an example of an early intermediate technique routine for classical guitar. So there are certain techniques that we have to maintain and that come up a lot in guitar playing. And I think for the early intermediate student, I'll describe what I think is important. However, of course, the more advanced you get, the bigger your technique routine will have to be because the variety of technique that's used in your repertoire will be more. So, of course, more advanced players need to practice longer and more and include more variety even in their material. But an early intermediate student is still probably trying to get down the basics of the main core classical guitar techniques. So that might be scales. And with all the different finger combinations, IM, MA, MA, you know, 3-fingered scales, AMI, AMI. Or a PI, you know, lots of different finger combinations. Arpeggio patterns or right hand patterns. You know, in my book, there's 100 open string exercises followed by the 120 Giuliani arpeggios. So tons of different like patterns for the right hand. You're probably working on all the combinations of slurs, hammer-ons and pull-offs. So, you know, that 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 2, 4, 1, 3, 1, 4. I think I got them all. So, you know, making sure you're practicing all those. And that's kind of why technique routines are sometimes very important compared to just practicing studies or etudes, which I also recommend. But technique routines tend to cover all the combinations of fingering, so you're really keeping your hands in shape, so to speak. So what did we do? We did scales, arpeggios, slurs, bar. Students often complain about how difficult bars are on the guitar, but I'll ask them, do you practice it every day? And they sometimes say no. And so you have to practice things and maintain that level and improve upon that level in order to be good at something. So make sure you're including them in your routine. I usually include, from even early intermediate students, some basic stretch exercises. It can be pretty minimal, but I feel like it's good for the hand and opens up the hand. As long as the student's not tense, they can do it in a relaxed way. So like those kind of vertical counterpoint kind of exercises, or also some horizontal stretch, you know, between different fingers. So the stretch between those fingers and then between those two. So that might be like, for an early intermediate student, that might be enough material there. And then of course they'll have a few items on their improvement list, so techniques they want to improve upon, or new techniques they've encountered that they are practicing as well. But that variety of technique is very important. Let me now talk about the complementary nature of having a variety of technique in your routine. Let's use tremolo as an example, because I get this question a lot on YouTube. It's like, how can I improve my tremolo? Of course, my technique book, like I said, it has a whole bunch of exercises aimed at improving or problem solving your tremolo. But most times when I introduce tremolo to a student for the first time, they are usually able to play it. Like, for the most part. They might not be perfect at it, but they're generally pretty good at it, because by the time I introduce it, I've already gone over lots of scale work with all the fingering combos. So all these two fingers are even, these two fingers are even, the arpeggios are even. And so when they go to play tremolo, to some extent, they have a well-balanced hand that can play evenly already. So all those different techniques they practiced came together to allow them to play tremolo. This is often a big issue because, if a student comes to me and says, I want tremolo advice, I want to know how I can improve my tremolo, I will actually literally answer them sometimes like, oh, you should practice scales and arpeggios. And that will not always do it for them. And I can show them some specific, ways to practice arpeggios, with creating gaps or closing gaps, and problem solving their tremolo practice. But really, most of the time, I will usually find deficiencies in their scale work or in their arpeggio work. And I'll say, well, your hand just isn't in the athletic zone to play tremolo yet. So we'll have to cover that and work our way up. Another complementary technique example would be when students come to me and there's a passage in the repertoire with an arpeggio that has a bunch of awkward string crossings, and it's just tough, and they're trying to get it up to speed, but it's just not working out. And they'll often ask, well, what can I do? And yes, my first answer might be, well, you can practice cross-string arpeggios. So instead of I, am, you go M, I, M, I. You could practice the technique that you're aiming for. But sometimes as well, if I look at their hand and it looks like there's an issue there in their hand, like something about their technique, their positioning, then I'll start to question whether we should actually just move further back and just practice scales. Because as you know, when we practice scales, awkward string crossings happen all the time. There's one right there. I, M, I. So I is reaching over M there, which is called an awkward string crossing. But we don't think of it as an awkward string crossing in our scale work, really. It's just a natural part of playing. But that's what it is. And so sometimes I will have students practice scales and make sure we work on their technique, and there's nothing in the way of those awkward string crossings or the way their hand is working across the scale. And then we'll start talking about the arpeggio pattern that they might be doing. If they're doing a pattern that for some reason requires I am, then that technique is very similar to just basic scale work, because we're just moving our fingers in this natural way. So sometimes we'll improve our scale technique in order to improve our arpeggios. And so that there's this cross-contamination between becoming good at all the different techniques that you use. And, one of the dangers of, like I mentioned before, one of the dangers of not practicing a variety of technique is that your hand positions might be off because you're practicing just like rest strokes. So you feel like that's okay to hold your hand like that. But then when you start mixing rest stroke and free stroke, you realize, oh, that doesn't work. So it also has it really informs all of your positions as well. That's why I'm giving this lesson today, is that it's so important that you start now practicing that variety of technique, because it's a big job. There's a lot of material to improve in there and to become pretty solid with. But once you get that core amount of technique together, like I described, you're in a pretty good place to play most repertoire. And most techniques that come at you in your pieces, you'll be able to accomplish. But you have to start working on it now, and you have to make sure it's pretty well balanced. But like I said, if you have trouble deciding what should be in your practice routine, I recommend you go to my technique book. Even if you don't buy the book, the videos for all the routines are free. So you can go watch the absolute beginner routine, you can go watch the intermediate routine and see what's in there. So follow that link in the description, check out your individual level for what you might want to do. And if you're not sure where to start from the beginner. And if that feels pretty good, move on to the next level, or just kind of find your way in what zone you kind of fit into. But always err on the easier side. It's always a good idea. Ease your way into it, make sure you actually accomplish everything at a very high quality level, and then move on to the next routine.